Hello, everyone. My name is Alan Smith-Gillespie. I'm a director at the Carbon Trust, and I'll be talking now about the challenges faced by industry on the decarbonisation journey. I'll begin by setting an overall context about what the challenge at scale looks like and how industry feeds into that. Firstly, global emissions need to halve by 2030 to be on track for net zero. We've all been talking a lot about net zero, about what this means, and this scale of decarbonisation effectively will need to be replicated within industry. And industry, indeed, is going to be a key driver to enable that to happen. So, as overall context, this sets the level of the challenge. There is an initiative called the Science-Based Targets Initiative, or SBTI, which you may have heard of. And this is an umbrella organization that sets the standard for what decarbonisation looks like and needs to look like within the corporate sector. It's been getting significant traction over the last 5 years, with a majority of companies now that are setting targets that are aligned with 1.5 degrees within the scope 1 and 2, and also indeed setting net zero targets for their overall organization. So SBTI sets the standard of what decarbonisation looks like and what net zero looks like for companies. It's important to understand that carbon targets are relevant not just for scope 1 and 2 emissions for the own operations of companies, but also for scope 3. And we'll be looking at in this session about what this means for companies and what sort of targets you need to be looking at. The SBTI has set near-term targets that companies need to be striving for, as well as long-term targets. With regards to near-term targets, these are targets that replicate what that scale of decarbonisation is required over the next decade. There is a 1.5 pathway which companies can commit to and need to commit to for scope 1 and 2 emissions. And that is effectively a halving of scope 1 and 2 emissions within the next 10 years, or 4.2% annual reduction. And targets can be set between 5 to 10 years from a baseline year. So that is the scale of decarbonisation for any company that wants to say they are on 1.5 degree pathway and who want to apply to the SBTI to have targets approved. When it comes to scope 3 emissions, near-term targets have a choice of the 1.5 pathway, but also what is called a well below 2 pathway, which is still broadly aligned with the Paris Agreement. But what we're seeing is a ratcheting up over time of ambition, where companies are going to be more and more looking to commit to a 1.5 pathway, even for scope 3 emissions or value chain emissions. So if you're a company who wants to align with what global targets look like, or wants to align with the global targets, you need to be thinking about setting a 1.5 pathway target for your scope 1 and 2 emissions, and ideally the same for your scope 3 emissions, though you have a choice of also a less steep pathway. When it comes to long-term emissions, and here we're going into an area where the SBTI has just recently defined what these mean for companies, the scale of ambition really all converges to one point, which is net zero. Net zero by 2050 at the latest. And in absolute reduction terms, this means a decarbonisation of 90% from your baseline year. So regardless of what your near-term targets may be for scope 3, for example, ultimately, your targets for scope 1 and 2 and for scope 3 need to reach a 90% decarbonisation by a net zero target year, which is 2050 at the latest. There are slight variations depending on what industries you're in about the pathways. There is what's called sectoral decarbonisation approach or sectoral decarbonisation pathways for specific industries. But overall, they will all converge towards that net zero target. What we're seeing is companies now setting increasingly 1.5 targets for scope 3 emissions as well, and also net zero, committing to net zero. There are hundreds of companies now that are committing to this level of ambition of net zero by 2050, and indeed many committing to net zero by 2040. So this begs the question about what should companies be doing to actually achieve near-term targets and ultimately reach the net zero target, long-term target. Firstly, companies need to be forward planning what the investments are. So you need to be thinking about what your pathway would be, firstly, if you do nothing, and also what a lower carbon intensity pathway, growth pathway might look like. So this illustrates in a really simple manner how a company could look at forecasting its carbon emissions and decarbonization, starting from a baseline year through to a near-term target year, which for the SBTI needs to be 5 to 10 years from your baseline year, so say 2030, and ultimately to a long-term target year. Most companies will be growing, so what you need to be planning for is a lower intensity growth over the first decade, over following decades as well, and to be putting in place significant decarbonization actions. And this applies to both Scope 1 and 2, your own operational emissions, and also for Scope 3, if those Scope 3 emission targets apply to you. So looking at Scope 1 and 2 to start with, we'll delve into some of the actions which companies need to take. So the first point is that energy efficiency often gets overlooked, but energy efficiency, as many of my colleagues who are really specialists in this area often say, it should be the first fuel of choice. So taking action on energy efficiency opportunities will be often the lowest cost and the one that will actually set you up for success in the future, because you'll require less less energy consumption, and also any investments that you take to decarbonize will also be lower because you'll have lower consumption requirements. So energy efficiency around your own purchased energy, purchased electricity will be important, and where there is fuel consumption in your operations also very important indeed. For many companies, purchasing green energy will be another very easy win for decarbonization, where electricity is a big area of consumption for the company. This is a growing area, and depending on your geography, you may have more or less of these opportunities, but they will be expanding over time. So having a strategy for renewable energy procurement, whether it's green energy tariffs, or indeed looking at on-site energy procurement or PPAs, purchasing agreements with renewable energy providers, will be extremely important for you to look at. One of the big challenges for energy-intensive industries will be to look at alternatives to fossil fuel combustion, where there's high thermal energy demands. Hydrogen is going to be a big area, but as we've been looking at in the prior sessions, one of the themes that's emerging is hydrogen will be a big opportunity, but it'll be probably coming later than we're expecting, perhaps. And energy efficiency and other approaches will be really important to take in the short term. But putting in place your technology strategy for the coming years and seeing where hydrogen as an alternative, or electrification, or moving towards renewable fuel sources will be key. So having a technology investment strategy forward-looking over the next decade or higher will be extremely important, especially when you're going to be making capital purchases, capital expenditures in the next few years, so you're not locking yourself into high carbon technologies, which will expose you to risks, regulatory risks, carbon tax risks, and of course will make it incredibly difficult for you to achieve your carbon reductions in the coming decade. We'll now look at Scope 3 decarbonization. Scope 3 decarbonization is often one of the biggest challenges companies face, because they will have much less influence typically on organizations upstream in the supply chain, or indeed even with customers and the users of their products and services downstream. However, it is typically, in many cases, one of the biggest sources of impact that a company has. So in many sectors, supply chain, Scope 3 value chain emissions are multiples higher than Scope 1 and 2 emissions, which is why it's an important area for target setting and an important area for action. This requires, by definition, collaboration, jointly working with partners, suppliers, and customers. And there are going to be significant benefits in terms of improving your understanding of potential risks and transparency over high carbon areas in your value chain, and ensuring that you address those to de-risk potential regulatory costs downstream that might be passed on to you or passed on to your customers. But also many times when we work with companies, identify a number of opportunities that can make value chains much more resilient, and also identify opportunities for innovation that can then be passed on to your customers and add to your competitiveness in the market. So what do these potential areas of decarbonization look like? There are two sides of the same coin when it comes to supply chain emissions, for example. One is engaging with your supply chain and suppliers. The other is looking at your product offering as well. And there's a number of actions you can take that can have overall positive impacts on decarbonizing Scope 3 emissions. So for example, supplier engagement will be incredibly important to work with the suppliers so that they put in place their own plans and commitments to decarbonize. Looking at opportunities to do joint innovation projects, for example, to develop their skills and awareness of what they should be doing. And on the other side, looking at your own product offering, where actions you can take around product design can also have an impact on decarbonizing Scope 3 emissions. So for example, changing the materials of the products that you use, using much less carbon intensive products, using less of them will be important and actually can shave off significant amounts of upstream carbon emissions, Scope 3 carbon emissions. Also looking at areas of business model innovation where you can improve the circularity of products at the end of life and bringing those back into the supply chain. So all these areas of resource efficiency are going to be really important. And indeed, resource efficiency is an area that now the IEA initiative is going to be taking on board in the coming phases, and we'll hear a little bit more about that later. So circularity and business model innovation, bringing resources back into the supply chain is a very important lever to decarbonize Scope 3 emissions overall. And of course, there'll be other areas around transport and logistics, shifting towards electric vehicle and low carbon vehicle technologies will be very important too. So there's a number of levers that can be done, that can be applied by companies to address Scope 3 emissions. But it's important to stress that all these things will require collaboration. And indeed, what we see are three key areas that need to be looked at. It applies to Scope 1 and 2, and very much so for Scope 3 as well. In order to create a core engine for deep decarbonization of Scope 3 emissions, companies will need to be thinking about data, improving data, both for insights about where to act, but also in order to measure progress and measure impact. That's one area. The second is to bring together decarbonization actions and identify what are going to be the biggest actions that should be prioritized. That is going to be applying the levers that we just talked about, or entirely new innovations, and working with innovators to bring those opportunities into your operations or into your supply chain. And thirdly, green finance is going to be very important to help pump prime the opportunities that are going to be that need to be implemented. And that those three all work together. You're going to need data to be able to report impact to providers of green finance, and you're going to have solid investment opportunities for carbon reduction in order to apply for green finance as well. So those are going to be three really important areas that work together very closely. Tying all these things together, in order to have a coherent strategy, companies need to be thinking about, and you need to be thinking about 5 key areas, and ensure that you've got plans in place over the coming year or so to act on these. One is to improve your understanding of the context in which you work, in which you operate. So getting better visibility, for example, on your Scope 3 in your supply chain, if you don't already have this, to understand what are the key drivers of carbon there, the key opportunities for decarbonization. To set ambitious targets, and the SBTI and science-based targets are the standard to be meeting. Investors question companies now. If they have a target and is not approved by the SBTI, they're very exposed to explaining why that's not the case. So SBTI aligned Scope 3 targets and Scope 1 and 2 targets are going to be very important. Implementation, having a strong implementation plan, which means all the way from governance through to investment, through to identified projects, is critical. And that's a plan that's going to evolve over time. But again, investors and partners will want to understand more and more detail now what you have in place, what your plan is, and how you're planning for success to achieve those targets. Innovation in all forms are going to be important. Innovation in terms of technology, innovation in terms of new ways of working with partners, and also business model innovations around circularity and resource efficiency will be critical. And lastly, Influencing is another area that is often overlooked. So what role can you play to help influence the change that needs to be happening at the systems level, working with government, working with other players in your value chain, and working together to create the change that needs to happen, regulatory change, for example, to create a level playing field, or in fact to drive investment more broadly into the actions that are required, is going to be key. And all those things need to be reflected in terms of your strategies for your own operations, in your value chain, and also in opportunities where you can have a broader impact beyond your value chain as well. So I hope this gives you an overall perspective of the actions and opportunities that you need to be thinking about. And next, we'll be hearing from 7 IEEA Phase 1 and 2 participants who will be sharing insights into their innovation demonstration projects. They will talk about the novel technologies that they have developed and demonstrated, their results and future plans. And following this, my Carbon Trust colleagues will share further information about how to take part in Scope 3 of the IEEA. Thank you very much.